Hi everyone, welcome. As we get started here, I'm just going to welcome everyone and let you know that this will be a recorded webinar, and there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers and discussion at the end of our speakers talk today. Um, please use the Q&A function in order to type up your answers, and there'll also be or your questions, and there'll also be an opportunity for you to ask questions by raising your hand and opening your mic later on. So welcome everyone. As one very small step in working to repair relations with Native nations and tribes, I'm going to get us started with Evergreen's tribal acknowledgement, which was developed with a number of local tribes here in the South Sound. We gratefully acknowledge and honor the Squaxin Island tribe, whose traditional homelands the Evergreen State College Olympia campus is situated. For thousands of years, their ancestral families lived and thrived here. They named Bud Inlet State Chas and Eld Inlet, where the campus is located, Squattle. Today, the Squaxin Island tribe continues to live on and steward the lands and waters of the southern Salish Sea. We also gratefully acknowledge the Puyallup tribe, whose traditional lands Evergreen's Tacoma campus is located upon. We respect and acknowledge the Squaxin Island and Puyallup tribes and other tribes across the Americas and their many contributions to the Evergreen State College in support of education, tribal sovereignty, environmental stewardship, and more. This acknowledgement, again, is just only one really small step towards respect and collaboration with the aim of uplifting the voices, cultures, and histories of the tribes of these lands and waters. Um, I'm so grateful to host Dr. Nikki Luke as our speaker for today's climate lecture. As many of you know, I am the director of the Center for Climate Action and Sustainability here at the Evergreen State College. And one of my favorite things to do is host this climate lecture series because we really get an awesome opportunity to hear from amazing people doing good work all over the country, advancing the sort of climate action and hard work of doing climate action that's needed. I invite you all to check out some of our past climate lectures on our website, evergreen.edu/climate, where we have all of our lectures recorded and posted on YouTube, and you can find a link there. So in this tradition of welcoming fantastic speakers to Evergreen through the Climate Center, I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Nikki Luke. Nikki is an assistant professor of geography at the University of Tennessee. Her research examines labor and environmental justice in the U.S. South. And I've been a big fan of Nikki's work, following it probably for almost 10 years now, I think, since early on in attending the Dimensions of Political Ecology conference at the University of Kentucky. Um, Nikki has done amazing things, and in 2025, she was appointed by the former Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, to serve on the U.S. Department of Energy's 21st Century Energy Workforce Advisory Board. She formerly worked at the DOE as an energy workforce advisor in the Office of Energy Jobs. And Nikki is the author of a forthcoming book that we're all very excited to read called Electric Life, Utility Regulation and the Fight for Energy Democracy in Atlanta. Nikki holds a PhD in geography from the University of Georgia. So as you may imagine, with all of this really fantastic experience and expertise, I felt I had to have Nikki come speak with us as we enter this world of increasing uncertainty and a hostile environment for climate action in many ways. We're going to need to prioritize ways to build good green jobs. And as such, I think Nikki's work is a good guide for many of us who are working to build pathways for the future climate workforce and addressing the climate emergency that's in front of us. So with that, today's Nikki's talk is entitled Making Solar Jobs Good Jobs. And I can't wait to hear from you, Nikki. Thank you for being here with us.
Thanks for that very generous introduction, Anthony, and thanks for having me. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. Okay, I'm gonna try to enter the right screen share. Are we good? Cool. So yeah, as Anthony shared, I'm based in Tennessee, and I've done a lot of work for the past year and a half thinking about Inflation Reduction Act implementation, and particularly some of the work to try to create good jobs in the energy sector. Thinking about the region of the country where I live, and also trying to learn from some of the best practices deployed at the federal level and across the country. So I'm going to be thinking about that today in the context of the Inflation Reduction Act, which has been in the news a lot. A proposed budget came out from the House yesterday that proposed some cuts to the Inflation Reduction Act, and hopefully we'll have time to talk about that and what that holds for the future later in the talk. But again, just thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Anthony, for the invitation. And I also want to share that some of the work I'll be presenting on today, I've been working on with my colleague Elena Lauder at the University of South Carolina. So this reflects a lot of collaborative research as well. But I'll go ahead and get started with a story about some workers who I met last summer. From the Solar Workers United Union, who in 2023 launched an organizing drive to form a union at a solar contractor where they work. And one worker who led the effort explained, quote, "There are lots of reasons why you'd unionize. One is pay for sure, and just a lot of other things. You know, as a company, we've seen our revenue grow exponentially, year to year, without many people seeing any kind of financial benefit from that. And without really adjusting to a management style that can efficiently cope with the amount of work that we have now in front of us. So that was another big thing. We were looking to try and influence just better policy in general, as far as how we interface with management and with the investment company that owns us." Workers at the firm where Jared worked formed the union Solar Workers United because they wanted higher pay and a greater say in decisions at their company. They'd watched their firm grow from a predominantly residential solar installer to an increasingly larger and more profitable commercial and industrial scale installer, made possible by incentives from the Inflation Reduction Act. This landmark piece of legislation, adopted by Congress in 2022, expanded investment and production tax credits for clean energy, including solar, wind, hydrogen, carbon capture, and clean energy manufacturing. But the concerns about low pay, poor benefits, and high pressure to complete installations in short timeframes are not unique to the place where Jared was working. For years, journalists, academics, and unions have documented exploitation and reliance on temporary, underpaid construction workers in the solar industry, who face punishing travel schedules on nationwide installation projects, disparities in pay and per diems across racial and gender lines, and exploitation through temp agencies that offer no formal labor protections. The New York Times summarized in a widely shared sentiment within the construction industry, as reported here in this 2021 headline, that, quote, "Building solar farms may not build the middle class." As a result, the building and construction trades unions, who are the largest unions that represent workers in the construction industry, have long disparaged the solar industry outside of specific places like California, where they've been able to leverage permitting laws to organize most of the utility-scale solar construction. In 2020, North America's building trades unions released the report here, arguing that, quote, "Tradespeople report better project variety, skill development, and project consistency in the oil and natural gas industries compared to the work being done in the wind and solar industries." The skepticism surrounding solar is important to consider, particularly given that solar is one of the fastest growing industries and the fastest growing resource on the US electric grid. And winning union support is and has been key to winning political support for climate and clean energy policy. So to reverse this perception of solar and improve jobs in the industry, numerous steps were taken under the Biden administration to strengthen organized labor's position. The administration pushed clean energy and infrastructure policy and utilized executive orders to support, quote, "a diverse solar workforce with good paying jobs, including pathways to stable careers with the free and fair chance to join a union." Eventually, these efforts culminated in the Inflation Reduction Act that passed in 2022, and I'll probably call the IRA throughout the talk, with a significant benefit to the unions that doubted their future in the clean energy sector. Beyond expanding tax credits, the IRA also added a bonus for the first time ever, increasing the value of a tax credit five-fold from 6% to 30%, For taxpayers who pay prevailing wage and hired apprentices enrolled in registered apprenticeship programs for at least 15% of the hours worked on the job. And the justification here was that public money should be used to support public welfare in the interest of higher quality jobs. Registered apprenticeship programs are 2 to 5 year training programs that are the gold standard in the construction industry, combining on the job and classroom instruction. Apprentices receive pay increases as they move through the program and graduate with an industry recognized credential. Historically, apprenticeship was the domain of craft labor unions. While unions are not the only sponsors of apprenticeship programs, and they can also be sponsored by employers or groups of employers such as trade associations, the building trades unions train the majority of construction apprentices in the US. And given apprenticeships' identification with unions, a trade association of non-union contractors decried the IRA immediately after the law was signed as, quote, a brazen attempt to leverage federal tax policy to boost union membership. In contrast, the inclusion of labor standards and subsequent rulemaking by the Biden Treasury Department that oversees tax credits won the support of the building trades despite their previous condemnation of solar and wind jobs. And they praised the rock-solid commitment to working families in the construction industry. A question remains, however, 2.5 years after the Inflation Reduction Act passed, as to whether the wage and apprenticeship standards are enough to change the perception and reality of solar employment and make clean energy jobs good jobs. To analyze this, I focus on the solar industry specifically and look at how policy approaches to workforce development have changed over time, focusing on the period since the IRA's adoption. First, I review the geography of union density and the history of just transition to provide a genealogy of the legislative and regulatory changes that led to the apprenticeship and wage standards in the IRA. Second, I share data on the first 3 years of the IRA's deployment, in which we see a growth in the number of non-union apprenticeships across the US. Third, I report on preliminary data from interviews with apprenticeship training providers, program administrators, and tax consultants who address the rise of non-union apprenticeships and some of the barriers to expanding union representation in the construction industry. And I conclude in asking what these results mean for a just transition and the need for more aggressive legislation that does not rely on voluntary provisions to incentivize labor standards, and instead requires appropriate training, minimum wages, and social protections to provide for all workers in and beyond the construction sector. So my analysis is shaped by the field of labor geographies, which argues that workers have an active role in shaping the economic landscape, from collective bargaining with their employers at specific work sites to determine wages, benefits, health and safety practices, to efforts to organize for a living wage in a city or a state. Much of the labor geography scholarship in the US and Europe has focused on union activity as the primary political space where people come together as workers. Yet this has limitations in the US, where more than 90% of waged workers are not union members. Non-union workers, in addition to all the kinds of unpaid labor performed in the home by parents, elders, and caretakers, necessary to support, train, educate, and prepare the next generation of workers, is often underexamined in scholarship that focuses on unions alone. While I talk about unions and on-the-job training programs here, it's important to keep in mind the kinds of effort that workforce development programs in education require on and off the job, how that's paid and how that's assumed in order to secure a career and shape one's future earning potential. Labor geographers have also argued that it is critical to understand the institutions and political actors that influence industrial, economic, and workforce development policy and shape working environments, economic mobility, and racialized and gendered disparities in the labor market. For instance, in one important intervention to map the contemporary geographies of union density in the US today, Jamie Peck traces the growth of right-to-work laws that were first adopted in the US South after World War II to restrict interracial organizing between white and Black workers. These laws, which unions have decried as the right to work for less, and I have a map here, make it harder to maintain union membership, given prohibitions on voluntary dues checkoff for union fees. And so you can see on the map here, Washington is not a right-to-work state, it's a pro-union state. Tennessee, where I live, is a right-to-work state. Over time, right-to-work laws and other anti-union measures have expanded, and union membership has fallen, with right-to-work states having the lowest union density in the country. In many cases, right-to-work states already had lower union membership when these laws were adopted, and it is difficult to argue that right-to-work laws singularly contributed to declines in union membership. There is nonetheless a sense that these measures signal a pro-business ethos, and investment has flocked to these regions over time. Jamie Peck observes that since the 1960s, when the union density rate stood at 31% for the country as a whole, just 23% of the US population resided in right-to-work states. Today, the union density rate has slumped to 9.9%, and the expanding territory of right-to-work states now accounts for 48% of the country's population and 47% of total employment. Thus, as these laws expand and people move south, they layer on top of other changes in the global economy, including anti-labor neoliberal reforms, attacks on the National Labor Relations Board Authority, outsourcing and globalization that weakened the US labor movement. Since the 1970s, what we've seen is union membership has fallen nearly 15%, such that less than 10% of all workers are now union members. The decline is even more dramatic in the construction industry, with the share of construction workers who are union members falling 27% over the same 50-year period. This is consequential as inequality has grown during the same period, with the top 10% of income earners capturing a larger share of national income. Unions, many have argued, effectively bargained for higher wages and benefits for the middle class, with spillover effects that also benefit non-union workers, and their political and economic power has declined with lower union density. And so the differences in labor geographies shaped by differences in labor law are important to understand the barriers that unions face in trying to organize new clean energy work sites, especially given that nearly 80% of announced clean energy investments between 2022, when the IRA was adopted, and 2024 were directed to right-to-work states. While these represent investments in trying to rebuild industrial capacity, national unions also face challenges in trying to organize. And so you can ask what this means for climate policy, which has in general and historically split organized labor, particularly given that fossil fuel industries and utilities have remained a bastion of union power. Utilities have the highest union density of any private sector industry in the US. Beginning in the 1980s, when amendments to the Clean Air Act were proposed to reduce smog and acid rain, building trades unions and other industrial unions who represent manufacturing, mining, power plant, and refinery workers opposed environmental and climate policy that might threaten their jobs. Against these headwinds, labor leader Tony Mazzocchi of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union asserted that socially necessary environmental policy was important, and workers should not bear the burden of these policy needs. Instead, workers should be offered a just transition to retirement or new employment through retraining, relocation assistance, wage replacement, and benefit guarantees if they stood to lose their jobs as a result of environmental policy. This idea, that he coined a just transition, gained prominence through coalition organizing with environmental justice groups and was championed by international unions in global climate negotiations. In 2015, unions released the Guidelines for Just Transition towards Environmentally Sustainable Economies and Societies for All through the International Labor Organization that defined a just transition in part through the decent work agenda and a commitment to social dialogue or collective bargaining between employers and unions, social protection for workers, protecting rights in work, and creation or assurance of employment. A few months later, a commitment to just transition was embedded in the preamble to the Paris Climate Accords. Yet despite this progress on the international stage from the 1980s to the 2010s, climate policy stagnated in the first Trump administration, when President Trump pulled the US out of the Paris Climate Agreement. In response, a progressive coalition of Democrats put forward the Green New Deal resolution in 2019, something many of us are probably familiar with. But I think it's important to remember that this also included labor provisions, calling for, quote, a fair and just transition for all communities and workers by, among other things, quote, strengthening and protecting the rights of all workers to organize, unionize, and collectively bargain, free of coercion, intimidation, and harassment. Both climate and pro-labor legislation have been difficult to advance in a divided Congress. The Green New Deal resolution never made it out of committee. The Protecting the Right to Organize, or PRO Act, is a bill that would reverse amendments. It would reverse a tax on the National Labor Relations Act and make it easier to form a union, has languished since first being passed by the House in 2019. The Raise the Wage Act to increase the federal minimum wage from $7.25 an hour, where it has been since 2009, has repeatedly failed. These ideas, nonetheless, influenced Joe Biden on the campaign trail in 2020 when he put forward the Build Back Better agenda during the pandemic, promising sweeping investment in infrastructure, clean energy, schools, housing, and childcare, with the same commitment to union careers. In 2021 and 2022, Democrats in Congress passed the CARES Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS Act, which retained commitments to good union jobs. Yet the question of how to achieve this in practice was contested. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which the labor provisions of which are quoted here, put more than $1.2 trillion into infrastructure spending, and included a provision that all laborers and mechanics employed through these grants must be paid prevailing wage. Under the Davis-Bacon Act of 1931, the Department of Labor conducts wage surveys that are occupation and county specific, which are intended to prevent the federal government from undercutting or disrupting the local construction labor market in areas where they were hiring during the Great Depression. These wages have been updated since, and what we find is that in areas of high union density, the union negotiated wage rate can prevail, giving an implicit advantage to union contractors by preventing non-union contractors from undercutting them on pay. However, this only applies to those construction jobs. In addition to including the incentive for prevailing wage, the IRA also added apprenticeship standards, leaning on another Depression-era law, the 1937 Fitzgerald Act, which outlined the process to register apprenticeship programs with the U.S. Department of Labor. This framework is important and an important step forward in recognizing some of the concerns of organized labor, yet it had at least 4 important limitations. First, while these measures place strong labor standards on construction of bridges, factories, and clean energy facilities, they were silent on the operations jobs for the people working in those facilities, including those spurred by these measures. A provision that would have expanded the reach of federal labor standards beyond the construction sector to make only union-built cars eligible for the full $7,500 consumer tax credit included in the IRA were struck from the final bill. The United Auto Workers President Shawn Fain described in 2023, quote, "So far it's been disappointing. If the IRA continues to bring sweatshops in a continued race to the bottom, it will be a tragedy, showing there isn't complete consensus on these measures across the labor movement." The Department of Energy, which administered many of the BIL and IRA competitive grants, required applicants to demonstrate how they would ensure community benefits, including good jobs, through requirements for community benefits plans on any competitive grant funding, which the Trump administration is currently in litigation as they have attempted to cancel these voluntary commitments. Second, and related to the silence on operations workers, there's no guarantee of a transition for incumbent workers at mines, refineries, internal combustion vehicle factories, or the many other carbon-intensive jobs that exist across the economy. In fact, economic analyses of carbon exposure across the U.S. economy demonstrate that many more jobs in communities than those targeted in the IRA will be at risk of significant economic upheaval. Further, as recent research on refinery workers in California has demonstrated, many industrial workers do not have credentials like an apprenticeship or a journey worker card to improve their years of expertise and experience on the job and transition into another kind of employment. And many also feel that they're too old to start over in something like an apprenticeship program if they face job loss. Third, the IRA utilizes tax law, and compliance is left in the hands of a notoriously understaffed IRS, which must retroactively review certified payroll records when the tax credit is claimed, opening the door to fraud and wage theft. The IRS has made allowances that further incent union contracts, such as reducing fines for noncompliance on projects covered by a project labor agreement, which is a pre-hire collective bargaining agreement specific to the construction sector. But this, again, means that there's a long time between workers actually employed on the job and eventual IRS enforcement. Finally, and relatedly, political economists have critiqued the IRA as a system of all carrots, no sticks, that encourages socially beneficial climate and employment outcomes through incentives, rather than using the authority of the federal government to reverse the uneven development of the US labor market, ease the pathway to unionization for workers who want a union, raise wages and benefits, or fund a just transition. And so with these limitations in mind, I set out to understand how the prevailing wage and apprenticeship standards are influencing the solar industry in particular. My analysis is based on a review of data from reports published by the Solar Energies Industry Association, the Interstate Renewable Energy Council, the U.S. Energy and Employment Report of the U.S. Department of Energy, the Bureau of Labor Statistics Occupational Employment and Wage Statistics tables, and the U.S. Department of Labor Registered Apprenticeship Partners Information Database System dataset, or the RAPIDS dataset. And so the RAPIDS dataset compiles all data reported to states by the U.S. Department of Labor on registered apprenticeship programs. I use the RAPIDS data to understand the change in apprentices and apprenticeship programs in trades that the building trades identify work at least 40% of the time in solar. This includes carpenters, electricians, iron workers, laborers, operating engineers, and solar installers. All told, there were approximately 200,000 workers active in apprenticeship programs in these trades in 2025. By comparison, there were approximately 180,000 people who worked in solar electric power generation construction in 2025. So while including all apprenticeship programs in these trades overcounts the number of apprentices who work in solar, this method allows me to capture trends in apprenticeship since the IRA was adopted. I focus on the period from 2019 to 2025, given significant swings in active participation in apprenticeship during the pandemic when employment was disrupted for many. And over this time, we see, following a trend to encourage apprenticeship from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, the number of people enrolled in registered apprenticeship programs of any kind nationally increased 23.5%, and 31.5% in my specific trades of interest. And so the number of people in apprenticeship overall is growing. The number of people in construction apprenticeships, which is pictured here, including the geography of those apprenticeships, is also growing. And so apprenticeships are on-the-job training, meaning that an apprentice is an employee and also completing classroom instruction as part of their training program. There are three different kinds of programs that are recognized in the Fitzgerald Act. Joint programs are those coordinated between a union and an employer. Non-joint programs are those managed by a single employer, and group programs are managed by a group of employers or trade association. In the RAPIDS dataset, these are broken down into union, non-union, and unlisted. And since I don't know enough information about the unlisted ones, those are not included for the purposes of this discussion. And what we see in literature on apprenticeship across the many different kinds of apprenticeship that exist are that these different kinds of programs lead to different outcomes. Apprentices who graduate from union apprenticeships receive a journey worker card that demonstrates their experience and allows them to sign up with a union hiring hall. The curriculum and credentials used by non-union programs are less standardized. Although trade associations, particularly in solar, are working to standardize learning outcomes for construction, craft labor apprentices. The category used by many solar companies, given that solar installer has not been certified as a separate apprenticeable occupation by the Department of Labor. That's really wonky, but I can tell you what that means later. Those in non-union apprenticeship programs had to be hired as full-time employees, but do not have the benefits of union membership, such as the ability to return to a union hall to find work if they're laid off between construction jobs. What we find in analyzing all of this data is that on average, the starting wage for apprentices in non-union programs was lower. In fiscal year 2025, it was $18 an hour versus $19.95 an hour for those in union apprenticeship programs. Across the industry, whether in a union position or not, there's been a stagnation of wages in these occupations when adjusted for inflation using the Consumer Price Index. We further find disappointing outcomes across both union and non-union apprenticeship programs in racial and gender diversity. Of workers who shared their demographic data with the Department of Labor, women, Latino, Black, and veteran workers, as well as Asian workers, are underrepresented relative to their share of the US workforce. Union programs in the trades show similar lack of diversity while having slightly higher representation of Black workers. We also wanted to understand whether the kinds of programs change in these fields over time, and whether the differences vary by geography to assess whether the IRA has been effective in encouraging use of union apprenticeships specifically. What we found was a significant increase in union and non-union programs of 25% to 23% between 2019 and 2025. With a larger increase in the number of people enrolled in non-union programs relative to union programs. And this is looking nationally in the table on the left. These increases in non-union programs were even larger in right-to-work states, where the number of people enrolled in non-union programs increased 65%, compared to a 28% increase in union participants. What we see overall is that in these specific industries that make up the solar sector, the share of apprentices enrolled in union programs nationally falls from 70% to 64% between 2019 and 2025, while the share of apprentices in non-union programs in right-to-work states falls from 57% to 51%. The 6% decline in union density and apprenticeship is larger than the drop in apprenticeship and union membership in the construction industry overall, where union density fell 2.5% nationally during the same period, despite moderate gains in union membership in 12 right-to-work and pro-union states, kind of a smattering of states. And so we can home in on what this means for the solar workforce when looking at the solar census conducted by the Interstate Renewable Energy Council and the U.S. Department of Energy U.S. Energy and Employment Report, which both utilize an employer survey to tease out trends in specific energy technologies. And so you see kind of this slowing down in the increase in number of people employed in the industry. And over time, they've shown that the share of union members has grown to 14% in 2023, the most recent data, higher than the overall energy workforce, but this varies significantly by state, with California, a highly unionized state, highly overrepresented in the solar sector. And so despite what we see as gains in union membership in the industry overall, this is likely due to the overrepresentation of workers in California, where across the rest of the country, particularly in the right-to-work states where solar and clean energy investments are growing, union membership has been in decline. The next phase of our project will cross-reference state-level findings with the Clean Investment Monitor database to understand whether any trends in increasing and decreasing union membership are correlated to federal bill and IRA investments and solar construction in particular. To date, to try to understand these trends, we've spoken with union and non-union apprenticeship providers, state administrators, and IRA consultants, conducting more than 20 preliminary interviews with about the impact of the IRA to understand the effects on business at different scales. None of the installers who we talked to said that their apprenticeship program helped them to secure more work, explaining that the solar industry is already booming and there aren't enough people to build the projects, period. Yet the IRA has changed the economics of different projects. As one solar company explained, they would never scope a project without factoring in apprentice compliance for the enhanced tax credit, saying, quote, "It's the difference between 6 and 30%. I haven't seen anybody do that." In effect, hiring apprentices became mandatory for contractors working in solar. While IRA rules provide for good faith exemptions for developers who tried to hire apprentices and were unable, such as repeatedly contacting local union halls, many have tried for more sustainable solutions, such as becoming signatory to apprenticeship programs. Sally, the program coordinator for a large non-union group program based in the South, shared that the interest in their apprenticeship program has, quote, exploded since the IRA passed. Her company works on a model where they charge a fee for service to track and provide the in-classroom and virtual training for apprentices who are working for more than 20 different companies. She shared that, quote, a lot of companies, when they first approach, they don't really care about the apprenticeship. So there's a lot of education around that now. Because beforehand, we were working with companies who were interested in training and retention of workers and looking at ways to improve safety training, professionalism, retention of their workforce. They were in it for all the right reasons. And now we're finding that is more, obviously now that it's a requirement if they want to work on an IRA site, that they meet the apprenticeship requirement of the Inflation Reduction Act. So now we do end up with a lot of people who initially they just think, quote, oh, give me a piece of paper that proves I have apprentices, or just lend me an apprentice for a week and then take them back, which is not what we do. So there's a lot of explaining exactly what apprenticeship is and how it's a long-term commitment to the training of their staff, how it's going to benefit them, that kind of thing. So again, despite these initial intent to try to improve job quality in the sector, there's been a lot of education to really change the existing practice of how companies hire and recruit people. New web tools, accounting and tax firms, insurance providers, and workforce consultants like Sally have cropped up to help developers and their subcontractors meet the IRA guidelines. Keith, a consultant who helps companies become IRA compliant on their apprenticeship hiring, shared that large engineering, procurement, and construction firms have, quote, people to figure this out. And they've already been in the business of paying prevailing wage, Davis-Bacon Act work, and apprentices aren't necessarily that new to them. It's the everyone else that has to be involved in this. And so that's from the solar installer to the excavation to the fencing contractor to the people putting in concrete pads. For Keith, all of these people faced a new burden that he actively described as a tax on their business. In contrast, Sally argued that the smaller contractors are actually much more into it than the larger EPCs, those engineering procurement contractors, because they rely on the EPCs for work. They want to say, hey, I'm ready, I'm here, I have everything in place. They see it, having an apprenticeship program, as a competitive advantage. The kinds of programs that developers seek out are influenced by their geography. Timothy, an apprenticeship program coordinator at a solar firm in the South, in one case, another apprenticeship developer, sorry, I'm missing a slide, so just bear with me for a second. Timothy, an apprenticeship program coordinator at a solar firm in the South, parroted an anti-union line. Let's see if that's on the next one. Yeah. That said, our company is a non-union company and very strongly says we don't want that. Just because we feel like our company is a good company to work for, we don't need somebody to tell us and implying what the working conditions should be like there. Nonetheless, they work with unions in Hawaii, quote, because that's basically the work there. So it really depends on where it's at. But the company itself, mainland, is strictly non-union. Jeremy, whose firm is headquartered in a southern state, also said, so we do union projects, but we usually do that through a subcontractor. So usually it's the community. If you're in Michigan, they're going to say, yeah, in order to do this solar job, a certain percentage of it has to be done by union labor, or all of it. In contrast, Jeremy observed that in southeastern states, though where they're located, you just don't have a lot of union members. And hiring union is not something that his company would consider at all. Jeremy attributed the lower density of the South to the history of violent union busting that had taken place in his state, citing a historic example in a major city of a labor rebellion, and added that lower prevailing wages make it less competitive for unions. He explained, quote, Now, you can tell if you go to a county that maybe has a military installation, that they've had more federal work done, they may have higher prevailing wages because of unions that have come in to maybe build a project. But most of our prevailing wages in the Southeast are at the minimum. They're still at like $11 an hour. He said that his company pays well above that, citing that Buc-ee's, a regional gas station chain, pays $23 an hour. Keith echoed, quote, "Everyone is paying more than prevailing wage because the shortage is there," meaning that the prevailing wage requirements in the IRA were not setting a high enough floor to challenge wages in the industry. Derek, a representative from the trade association, argued that while the IRA has supercharged solar development, unions are coming to the industry at a disadvantage, given what he named a history of antagonism between unions and non-union or anti-union solar contractors. He asserted that the unions, quote, had concerns about the long-term stability of these jobs, essentially. And that's understandable because of what often people in the industry joke is the solar coaster, right? It's up and down. It's always been. And it continues to be today, as we see from tariffs and the trade wars and all that other stuff like that. These federal policies go up and down. I think most any union would tell you that they were reluctant to bring on new apprentices because it's a multi-year training commitment. That employer or that union is committing to that worker to complete that training program, but also the expectation that when they're now a member, a full journey person in the union, and they want to have them there and want to make sure that essentially they're going to have work for the next 10 years plus. Although that's starting to change, they're starting to say, the unions, oh yeah, we've got work for hundreds of apprentices today, and again with the Inflation Reduction Act for the next 10 years. Unions have been vocally supportive of the bill. This is one particular piece where that was reported in August of last year on the 2-year anniversary. One union leader said in a quote in a meeting with me that, quote, "It's the sword we will die on if congressional Republicans try to touch the IRA." And others reported that as a result of the IRA, they received calls from subcontractors and contractors who never would have reached out previously. Yet in the interviews that we started with unions in the South, others were less optimistic about solar in particular. Electricians, laborers, and ironworkers could point to wind projects and a handful of solar installations that they or their members had worked on. They had more work building clean energy factories, many of which were competing for workers in a rush to get manufacturing tax credits or competitive DOE grants that have a shorter time window than solar projects. One IBW business manager shared that the IRA had not changed much for them. They've had some people reaching out, but, quote, "not in the numbers that actually I thought we would have. I thought we would have more." That said, this idea was echoed by Carolina non-union Associated Builders and Contractors representatives, who also reported that the boom in demand for apprentices was, quote, "not as big as I thought it would be, and it's actually slowed down a little at the end of 2024. As the number of new programs grow, the question of whether they will compete with established union apprenticeships and seize a larger share of construction, shifting the industry away from the unionized stake that union apprentices historically had, is something that remains to be seen. Apprenticeship programs are costly to run and remain relatively small in scale. The largest non-union program we met with hired 945 apprentices between December 2023 and October 2024. Another had just finished hiring their 90th apprentice, representing about 2% of the company's total workforce. A survey of non-union solar workers in Texas, published by the Texas Climate Jobs Project in 2024, found that only 3% of survey respondents were enrolled in apprenticeship programs, well below the 15% threshold for the IRA tax credit. Of course, this analysis of where we are with the IRA and the question surrounding the IRA tax credits is somewhat interesting to bring up in this current moment, as a question remains whether the IRA tax credits will survive a budget reconciliation process currently going on in the House of Representatives. While broad bipartisan support has been signaled, climate and labor advocates are fighting for its preservation against proposed cuts that are currently being debated. And any proposed changes to try to strengthen the labor provisions feel outside the scope of possibility. Yet, in looking at where the IRA has brought changes in labor, hiring, and retention to date, reveals the limits of voluntary incentives to improve job quality, and particularly to promote unionization. Far from the initial goals of the Green New Deal, which would have advanced a decent work agenda and strengthening labor rights, shoring up social protection, and expanding clean energy and infrastructure employment to achieve a just transition, the IRA relies on voluntary incentives, a system that Daniela Gabor has criticized as all carrots and no sticks. The system, as it currently stands, is not improving solar jobs, let alone energy jobs, across the board. The energy sector employed 8.4 million people in 2023, accounting for 5% of the total US workforce, and apprentices in construction are only a factor of that. These incentives remain important, but far from enough of a carrot to force improvements in other jobs affected by climate change and climate policy, such as manufacturing, agriculture, disaster response, healthcare, and the many kinds of care work that all other workers rely on. While apprenticeship programs can and should do more to recruit women and people of color, more also has to be done to support these other sectors that are much more diverse and a much broader cross-section of the workforce. There's a need for policy thinking that is ambitious to achieve an affordable, just energy transition that assures families supporting livable wage jobs and a social safety net to sustain the working class. This requires thinking about energy policy as social policy that can build a social wage, and considering how the state can discipline, not merely nudge, the private sector. Ideas proposed in cities and states across the US provide a testing ground for how to link climate and labor policy and achieve some of these competing priorities, such as using public procurement to build clean energy or purchase clean vehicles, and promoting sectoral bargaining to achieve higher wage standards for all across the energy sector, as well as expanding employment protections for workers in communities that may see economic shocks from climate policy. Yet across the country, many of these policies have also utilized voluntary standards to avoid state or federal preemption. Given the uneven pattern of labor geographies that I've described today, and what we see as potentially deepening through the IRA, the work that we face is confronting the difficult task of how to build consensus for federal policy that addresses this uneven development in an effort to try to raise standards for all workers. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nikki. That was wonderful. We have some questions in the Q&A, and I just want to encourage folks to go ahead and type your questions into the Q&A function in Zoom. You can also raise your hand, I believe, and we can go ahead and let you ask your question verbally if anybody wants to do that. To get us started with the discussion, I think we can, well, I have a few questions here, and we have a couple questions in the chat already. So if folks want to raise their hand, feel free to do so. And in the meantime, I'll get us started with the question and then take one from the Q&A if that's okay. So my question is related to thinking about apprenticeships within sort of a just transition. And part of your talk, you mentioned some of those barriers that exist in terms of folks not basically having the time or don't want to lose wage or really restart their careers once they've are moving from, say, a fossil fuel sector job to a, say, for example, a solar industry job. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts or if your research dug into anything around apprenticeships for workers that, maybe have more experience and are moving from one industry like the fossil fuel industry towards a clean energy job. And if you have any thoughts on that, what kind of policy recommendations you might have, or if you just have any insights from what you've found in your work.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Anthony. And I think that that's a criticism I've heard that the emphasis has really been on how to improve job quality with a focus on new entrants to the field. So people who are starting their careers at an apprenticeship, although people of all ages join apprenticeship programs. We interviewed a couple of people who went back and started an apprenticeship program after their kids had graduated from high school. But generally, there have been efforts to try to make that work experience a little bit more legible to potential employers. And so Jesse Hammerling at the UC Berkeley Labor Center and Virginia Parks at the UC Irvine Labor Center have been doing a lot of work with the steelworkers unions on the West Coast around refinery closure, thinking about how to communicate sort of the work experience that someone who's been working for 10, 15, 20 years in a refinery has, that they can go and take to more likely a different manufacturer or an employer to represent some of those like welding, maintenance, dealing with pressurized gas, very specific kinds of skills. I think that the question of how to support workers who are transitioning is sometimes about trying to lessen the apprenticeship requirements to really make legible that there are people who bring different skills to the workforce. And then more broadly, there's also been an effort to try to standardize on-the-job training, not just for those fossil fuel industries, but also this was something that the Department of Energy looked into for battery manufacturing through the Battery Workforce Initiative to try to demonstrate the kinds of skills that would be required for working in battery recycling and battery assembly, with those same questions in mind of people transferring from internal combustion engine facilities to EV facilities, for instance.
Awesome. Thank
Yeah.
you for that. I'm just, I think that's something a lot of folks here in Washington State are also thinking of as we look to refineries here and thinking about what the future of those refineries are for our state. There's a lot of attention to that right now, even among um, state policymakers, those involved in advising state policymakers and the communities, obviously, who work in those industries. Um, so,
I would add one other thing that
yeah, please.
I mean, another piece I've seen encouraged is a voluntary incentive to hire workers who are leaving, either workers who are dislocated workers, particularly because, again, it's yet to be determined if it will survive the current budget cuts that are coming down in Washington, D.C., but that's something that employers can often find to be financially advantageous because there is money for training dislocated workers. And so pegging hiring targets, not just to hiring new workers, but those who are leaving other industries is something that we've seen discussed and encouraged in Louisiana and Texas.
Yeah. Um, thanks for adding that too. I'm going to take a question here from the Q&A from Katie. Katie asks, have you considered solar project scale at all in your research? I'm interested in job quality differences between smaller distributed solar and utility scale solar and how policymakers can ensure distributed solar jobs in particular are good jobs. The prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements in the IRA only apply to projects above 1 megawatt, for instance.
Yeah, thank you for this question, Katie. This isn't something that I've looked at in this current phase of research because we're really looking at how the apprenticeship requirements are being used and how they're changing apprenticeship standards. Something that motivated some past work I had worked on while working at the UC Berkeley Labor Center. This was a decade ago now, so it's a little bit dated. But at the time, there was a strong emphasis on trying to bring to hire workers for distributed scale solar jobs with these really short-term training programs that were unpaid or volunteer, and didn't necessarily have any kind of credential at the end, or in some cases, workers would even pay for those training opportunities. And so what we found was that those credentials, and I think that the work that organizations such as the Solar Energy Industries Association and IREC are doing currently to try to standardize curriculum in the solar industry is trying to address sort of that there was this history of green jobs training programs that didn't necessarily lead to improved employment outcomes, particularly in the Obama administration. That's a little bit of a rabbit hole, but I could talk more about that. And so trying to say like these are the learning outcomes that should be anticipated from an apprenticeship, or these are the learning outcomes that should be tied to some kind of solar installer training. Um, what was the the focus again of those training standards was to try to provide broad occupational training set in a position like an electrician or a carpenter, so that someone who received training could work not just in solar installation, whether at the utility or residential scale, but then also have a credential and the mobility to go work for a residential building contractor or working on some other kind of industrial or commercial construction. And so they have a little bit more ability to move between different employment options as a worker. There's also been this tension within employment data about how solar jobs themselves are tracked. So solar installer is an occupational category. It is not an apprenticeable category. And so we see some of these efforts. They're like electricians on average are making a little bit more than solar installers, which doesn't tell you as much about the solar industry because there's so many more electricians than just work in the solar industry. But that question of how to classify and then ensure safeguards for those different industries, I think is something that many different states have has been an issue for tracking and trying to understand job quality in general. And then states are also looking at some of these specific kinds of provisions about how to standardize job quality in different ways. I think about the work like in Illinois with the Clean Energy Jobs Act and the Future Energy Jobs Act, which even at the residential scale set criteria for, the level of training that a person has to have to connect a residential solar installation. And so those are measures that can create a barrier to working in that industry, but are also intended to try to create like a leverage point for workers so that they can say, I have these skills and I can command a higher wage in the labor market. So across the board, I don't have an answer to your question exactly in terms of job quality between residential and commercial scale. My research has shown a lot more volatility in both the kinds of work that residential installers are getting and the pay that they're getting over time. Whereas this particular project is really focused on apprenticeship, thinking about projects above that 1 megawatt scale.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that was I think um, probably a question that it's on the minds of many people who are thinking about sort of like community solar and other kinds of yeah, I guess more distributed solar type programs that seem to be in Washington State as well. And there's been a sort of perennial bill that has been proposed around expanding the size of community solar um, installations, what's allowed in Washington, and hopefully that will pass and allow larger installations. And with good paying union jobs as well involved in the installers. Um, I'm going to ask maybe just one more question, just to ask broadly about kind of what your thoughts are on the future of, I guess, apprenticeship programs and within the clean energy sector more broadly. Now that potentially the IRA is facing, uh, maybe it's just going to be erased, right? I don't know what the future holds, but maybe parts of it stick around. But I'm wondering if you think apprentices will continue to rise without the IRA support. And sort of as a lead on to that, do you think that will impact uh, union membership in this sector at all, or just, I guess, the quality of jobs available within the sector? Sorry,
I
that's a
think
big question.
I think that so the question of apprenticeship is something it's a there's been really strong bipartisan support for apprenticeship from the Democratic side because of the historical relationship that the Democratic Party has had with organized labor, and from the Republican side because it is an alternative, it's promoted as an alternative to college. I think both have um, the Democrats also see it as an alternative to college and a pathway to a career for people who are not going through higher education. And so what we've seen, if you can look at the apprenticeship data dashboard from the Department of Labor, which I showed early in the presentation. There's just been an astronomical increase in apprenticeship in general since 2015, which is the most recent data they currently have available. You used to be able to request it, but I guess with changes at the Department of Labor, they're not responding to my emails at the moment. If anybody else has luck with that, let me know. Um, so I think apprenticeship in general is something that many industries are adopting outside of the construction sector. So it's growing in healthcare. It's actually growing in education with kind of an augmentation to like a teacher training model. So I think there are benefits to someone getting paid for their on-the-job training that are seen widely. In terms of what it means if the IRA is repealed for the future of particularly clean energy apprenticeships or the future of the clean energy construction sector, I asked everyone who we interviewed this question, and there's a pretty wide spectrum of opinions. The construction industry overall is aging, and it's something people refer to as the silver tsunami, with the number of people expected to retire in the next few years. And so some of the larger employers who have kind of the financial ability to manage an apprenticeship or who work with a union where there's a joint financing of the apprenticeship through the dues system, I think they see it as really valuable and a way to bring new workers into the sector and to try to replenish these concerns about just really, really hard recruitment and retention issues that exist for many employers, but particularly in construction. Almost everyone we talked to on the non-union side said without the IRA, they don't think it's something that they don't see it as permanent because it's new and it's still seen as like a barrier or a box that people have to check off for those who haven't kind of seen the benefits in terms of a recruitment strategy. So to me, it's probably variable in terms of what it means for long-term changes to employment in the industry, but the benefits to some of the more established employers, I think, have been made more clear. And hopefully that also has the benefit of all the other things of improving retention for workers, improving job quality for workers too.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nikki. I think we'll go ahead and end the webinar now. I just wanted to say thank you so much for this talk and sharing all of this new research with us. I think it'll be really insightful for a lot of folks and helpful, especially for many of us in Washington State as we also navigate kind of the future of federal policy change in clean energy and figure out what that means for us here. Um, Always wonderful to see you, and I appreciate you spending this time with us this afternoon. Um, if folks want to get in touch with you, they can maybe email you with questions. Is that all right?
Yeah,
Uh,
that would be great.
all right, great. And of course, this is being recorded and shared, so hopefully a lot of folks get a chance to see this really amazing work. Thanks again. I think we'll close there. And thanks to everybody who was able to make it live today, and to all the Evergreen media staff who make these webinars very easy for us. So thanks to everyone. All right, take care.
Thanks all.